episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor.
Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show with another fascinating guest helping to create a better tomorrow on many different fronts. Today, we have the opportunity to be joined by Colonel Dr. David Barnes, who is Chief Artificial Intelligence Ethics Officer at the United States Army Artificial Intelligence Task Force, professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, Senior Artificial Intelligence Ethics Advisor at DARPA, and also a 30-plus year career officer in the United States Army. At the United States Military Academy, Colonel Dr. Barnes is the deputy head in the Department of English and Philosophy and a research associate for their Center for Innovation and Engineering. He serves on the editorial board for the Journal of Military Ethics and on the board of directors for the International Society for Military Ethics. And his current research interests include ethics, applied ethics, especially in the area of ethics of war, including just war tradition, humanitarian interventions, military privatization, as well as the ethical considerations of artificial intelligence and other new technologies. In addition to all that, he is a research fellow at the Stockholm Centre for the Ethics of War and Peace, Department of Philosophy at the University of Stockholm. He's also an accomplished author with his book, The Ethics of Military Privatization, the United States Armed Contractor Phenomena, which we'll get into in a little bit. Colonel Dr. Barnes has his bachelor's in aeromechanical engineering from the United States Military Academy at West Point, his master's in philosophy, University of Massachusetts Amherst, and his PhD in philosophy from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And just for a little background for some of our ex-US viewers, the United States Military Academy, also known as West Point, is a 4-year federal service academy in West Point, New York. The mission is to educate, train, and inspire the Corps of Cadets so each graduate becomes a commissioned leader of character, committed to the values of duty, honor, country, and is prepared for a career of professional excellence and service to the nation as an officer in the United States Army. Colonel Dr. David Barnes, thank you for taking the time to join our show, and obviously thank you for your long service to the country.
Oh, thank you so much, Ira. And I just want to thank you and all of the listeners out there for the chance to discuss some of the important topics that are emerging today with new technology, and especially in the sense how my curious background has led me to this area, and how we might be able to work together to make, in a sense, AI better for society, for everyone. I must start with an initial disclaimer, of course, that these are my own views and don't necessarily reflect those of the Department of Defense, the United States Army, the United States Military Academy, or any other department or agency of the U.S. government. So having had that out of the way.
Absolutely, I appreciate that. I love to start off as we typically do, hand you the floor for a little bit so we can sort of further get to know you. If you can sort of take us back to the beginning, everything from where you grew up, your initial sort of entry into the service, and then I also noticed that you did your PhD actually in the middle of several deployments. From what I saw on the bio, sort of somewhere between, I guess, Afghanistan, Iraq. I'm not exactly sure, but talk a little bit also about your interest in doing these studies, especially the PhD in the philosophy and of war and peace. That'd be a great way to start.
Absolutely. Many say that perhaps I'm some kind of unicorn, but I think everyone would agree that it's a bit of an odd duck. As you mentioned in the intro, I've been in uniform for well over 3 decades and spent most of my time in the operational Army. I'm an armor officer. I've been deployed on numerous occasions. And that's really also informed my thinking about ethics and just beyond the teaching of applied ethics that we do here at the Academy in terms of the ethics of war. So a bit about how I arrived at this place. My dad worked for IBM. He was in the Air Force when he was younger. And so I was used to moving a lot in my life. But one of the major influences was my grandfather, who made a career enlisted in the Army Air Corps and then in the Air Force, and then as an Air Force civilian and retired out of there. And so I knew from a very young age that I wanted to serve the country in some capacity. I was very fortunate in all those movings around to be able to secure a nomination to the military academy. And as you mentioned, I studied aerospace engineering. I've always been drawn to sort of the STEM side of things, which may seem a bit ironic to people when we mention ethics and philosophy. But I was fascinated with designing of helicopters, of airplanes, rockets. I envisioned myself as a rocket scientist one day and be able to use those kinds of skills. What I didn't know is that eventually, along in my long career, I would have an opportunity, in particular in this area of ethics of an emerging technology, to be able to reach back to that engineering education that I had back in the day. As you mentioned, I've very fortunate to lead and soldiers and non-commissioned officers in a variety of assignments, both at home, stateside, and overseas. I was deployed on a number of occasions and the conflicts that we've had over the last 20 years. And it was during those conflicts, though, when I had some free time, and probably it wasn't so much during those conflicts, but when I returned home and had time to sort of process things, I began to think about how we were using new technology, but even prior to that, some of the new mission sets that we were being asked to perform. For example, training and preparing for conducting peacekeeping and humanitarian operations in Bosnia and Kosovo, for example, seemed to be, tangential to how we had normally trained. And so when I went back to school, I was given the opportunity to study philosophy and earn my master's degree at UMass Amherst. I studied the ethics of intervention. I wanted to pull the threads a bit on that seemingly new area and what was involved in terms of the ethical decision-making behind a state determining to, in a sense, intervene in another state, but for humanitarian reasoning. And so that was really fascinating. And that began sort of this study of mine where I've had a boot in two camps, both on the operational side of the Army, as you mentioned, right? Periodically returning to units and deploying, but also having the opportunity to serve here at the military academy at West Point, where periodically during my career, I was able to teach the young men and women that would very soon take on the mantle of that leadership in the Army and help prepare them for a lifetime career to the nation. And so it was an opportunity to do something that I really enjoyed, that was teaching, but it also really allowed me to explore some other areas. And so much of what I do now is very much motivated by how we are educating and preparing not just the young leaders here, but how we might think about educating everybody in our country and society on whether we're talking about new technology or the policy decisions that our leadership makes. And so after that time, I returned back to the force and deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was given a very rare opportunity to continue my philosophical studies, which for so long had been this really neat habit. I call it a habit of mine, something that I enjoyed doing. One great thing about philosophy is that you really get to study the underpinnings of almost any subject. For example, the philosophy of law. I don't need to be a lawyer to study the philosophy of law, or even something in the STEM area, the philosophy of mathematics. What are numbers, for example? Sure. And so it was always something that I was interested in. Now I actually got to do that deliberately. After earning my PhD in Boulder, the area that I focused on there was exploring privatization. I had the privilege with working with many very professional security contractors in Afghanistan and Iraq. But I was really curious about this notion of outsourcing, and outsourcing in a way that perhaps to many seem antithetical to having a standing professional military, and how we might strike a balance between those, because there seem to be a lot of benefits, although much of the conversation, especially in the news, was concerned with these high visibility incidents and tragedies. Sure. And so I used that opportunity that I had while I was at Boulder to explore, again, the ethical perspectives, what sort of underpin some normative thinking about whether it was morally permittable for us to turn to outsourcing, and if so, then to what degree. Returning to West Point to teach, I was able to take on additional responsibilities and very rapidly became one of the senior philosophers and ethicists in the Army. So I was dabbling in some other projects. And so when I returned back to West Point, I had some colleagues in the engineering department that were looking at new research areas exploring soldier enhancement, robotics, and what started out as just some friendly discussions about some of these potential ethical considerations. We realized as a group that although in your ABET education at the time, this was years ago, it was mandatory to have some subject, some education, some classes on ethical considerations, let's say for civil engineering, for example. It really was nascent at the time. But that really opened my eyes to not only the potential that emerging technology is going to have, but the real need for a robust and meaningful conversation about doing it in a responsible way. Several of those individuals ended up moving from the military academy where they're here teaching, and they went to work at DARPA and became project managers there. And I was able to continue to foster those relationships. Had an additional deployment, this time to Kuwait, Jordan, et cetera. But that really began to solidify some of my thinking in this space. Again, partially how to better prepare our students here, but also, is there a way that we can contribute interdisciplinary perspectives about emerging technology? So here's an example. It's happened to a number of people, right? And in a sense, it's anecdotal, but a well-meaning contractors would show up on the FOBs, the forward operating base, with a new ground robot. And focus was testing it out. It had been tested at home, but now we're trying to see how best to employ it in an operational environment. But upon reflection, there really wasn't much guidance in that testing and that employment in terms of the ethical considerations. In other words, what do I need to know as the commander, or perhaps as a user, about unanticipated sort of effects of using a UGV or unmanned ground vehicle in combat, or even in other areas. And so this led then, combined with my relationships, on a very exciting project that a good friend of mine, Dr. Phil Root from DARPA, has led. We realize now it's been since 2018, and his project is called URSA, Urban Reconnaissance with Supervised Autonomy. Okay. And it's one of many DARPA projects, right? Because again, the intention of DARPA is to push the boundaries on what technology is possible, to ensure that the U.S. is not blindsided by other technological advantages. But this one was unique. What we decided to do is, can we form a team of subject matter experts that can help inform the different performers throughout the process in the phase 1 and 2, and thinking about the legal, moral, and ethical considerations that may be involved with developing new technology, in particular, this notion of supervised autonomy, with the idea that, like many DARPA projects, you're pushing the boundaries that technology may not work, but what we agreed was it was much too late to think about the legal considerations and ethical considerations at the very end, when the military, for example, was about to adopt it.
Sure.
And this has been a very successful project. And DARPA is looking at ways to take this kind of process and thinking and expand it into other sectors. Then coincidentally, the Army reshuffled its research and development and acquisition under a 4-star entity called Army Futures Command. And essentially, not much changed down below in terms of the processes, but it allowed a chain of command focused on generating efficiencies. In other words, if we have parallel projects that are working and have, through some gap analysis, an area where an advance in technology might satisfy both of those projects, or at least be able to advance it, then could we do a cleaner job of coordinating that and resourcing that for them? And there are 12 different cross-functional teams that are built upon the different projects that the Army is working on, both maintaining what we currently have, but also looking over the horizon to 2035 and beyond. Part of that is the Army's Artificial Intelligence Task Force. Okay. And it was a very small organization, meant to be agile, not designed to take control of all the Army's artificial intelligence research and development, but to be able to provide one belly button, a touch point to help coordinate for the Army and do some of this deconfliction. And it's connected to the Artificial Intelligence Hub, the AI Hub, that's located in Pittsburgh, and in close partnership with Carnegie Mellon, the National Robotics Engineering Center. And it has 11 other academic partners. And it was fortunate for me, and I can go into greater detail about it, but as it happened, it was an opportunity for me to, in a sense, do a bit of sabbatical, do some time giving back to the Army from my teaching position here. And, in conversation with the director and the deputy director at the time, we understood that there was this need to further explore the legal, ethical, societal considerations of artificial intelligence. There was certainly a lot of interest generated in the news and controversy as well. And we thought there was an opportunity to create a role like the one that I fill as the Chief AI Ethics Officer, to be able to explore it in a more rigorous manner.
Sure.
And my focus area broadly were in two areas: the up and out look, and that was everything from advising Army senior leadership about the responsible development and use of AI, as well as working with the Joint AI Center, the National Security Commission on AI, the Defense Innovation Board, in order to help shape that conversation that was happening across DoD, not just within the Army. Yeah. And I was very fortunate to be part of the writing team for the Innovation Board to help generate those AI principles, which the Secretary of Defense, Esper, signed off on in February of last year. So the Department of Defense has adopted those. So that was very exciting to be a part of that program. And then down and in, it was beginning to think how the Army will implement, thinking about ethics and artificial intelligence in a meaningful way. And really, in other words, is how do we do two things? One is better educate and train the force, right? From the youngest private all the way up to the secretary level, yeah, on the benefits of artificial intelligence, but also the risks and limitations of it, and cut through a lot of the noise that seems to be occurring about it, right? So that they're better prepared for employing it in the future. And then the other aspect was, how do we take those aspirational principles and put them into practice, right? Because it's one thing to have those guidelines, and they're absolutely necessary. And again, I'm very proud of the work that the department has done, in a sense, attempting to lead in this space. But if we want to take a principle like responsible or equitable, how does that translate down into particular programs? Sure. And what then are the metrics associated with that? A phrase you hear is, how do we operationalize those principles? Yep. And a lot of that work is very nascent now. But the Army is much like the rest of the department, in a sense, the rest of the private sector as well, with large corporations also having their versions of ethical principles, and how do they put it in practice that works well for them, right? Because the overall desire is in a sense, is to, from a commercial standpoint, is to, of course, have excellent technology that's going to be beneficial, right? It's also going to be profitable, but do it in a way that's going to benefit not just the company, but the rest of society. So and there's so much more work to be done in this space. But I think that gives a good sort of overview of kind of the problem space, but also how I found myself, in a sense, a large part of it.
Outstanding, outstanding. Really fascinating and an amazing sort of, not just amazing background, but the amazing set of sort of cross-functional responsibilities that you have. And I take my hat off to you if I had one on that. You know, you have this package, this portfolio of things you have to think about that are so extremely important. I wanted to drill down a bit, and you know, you gave us a great overview of the AI Hub, the Futures Command. I was reading, you know, you've been quoted a lot, and you know, there's been a lot of activity in the popular press on the AI front. You know, you've been quoted a bit recently in the news about a principle called total zone reconnaissance, where you talk about the interesting model where there's sort of the combination of the manned and the unmanned vehicles, whether they're aerial, ground vehicles, and so forth, in this interesting sort of set of nodes that basically integrate the soldiers and potentially these advanced technologies. And it was very interesting. There was a white paper I came across where you were referenced. The title of the paper was "The Ethics of Acquiring Disruptive Technologies, AI, Autonomous Weapons, and Decision Support Systems." And you specifically, they reference your study on something known as on the loop versus in the loop, in essence, where the human, or sort of how much you take the human out of certain aspects of artificial intelligence. Could you talk about what the difference is between on the loop and in the loop, and where sort of what the important balance is there when we pair humans with some of these technologies?
So in a way, I'm very pleased that some of my work and thinking is getting out there. Mm-hmm. And I think that the in the loop, on the loop, off the loop sort of mental construct is useful, but it's only useful to a certain degree. What really underlies this is this idea of how we're going to integrate and use AI as a successful tool, and at what level, right? So what's really sort of informing this idea is a number of concepts. One, you know, the concerns over lethal autonomy, of course, but also in all sorts of ways that we're going to envision human-machine teaming or integration. Yep. Now and in the future. And in a sense, you know, it raises concerns about, you know, artificial intelligence or that kind of system taking jobs from people, or how the workforce might modify to be able to incorporate that. And a lot of that is, in a sense, is who is going to be responsible, and in terms of at what point in it. So the loop mental construct, the in the loop, on loop, off loop, borrows strongly from Boyd's OODA loop, right? So orient, observe. I have to come back to that. But the idea is that, you know, traditionally we think of the human in the loop. In other words, that any sort of mechanical system, let alone one that might be AI enabled, will in a sense work out the calculations, if you would. But then it's up to the human, in a sense, to advance the system to the next set of decisions, mm-hmm. right? And this is found in older expert systems and decision trees, but also even now in more machine learning or deep learning type machines, right? Sort of the next level is the human on the loop, right? Okay. Where in the sense that the human has override. Right, so the system is performing its tasks. You know that it's expected, that it's trained for, it's deployed for that reason. But the human can intervene, and if things begin to go awry, or if the situation changes or becomes so complex that it's no longer beneficial to have that system functioning in that way. And then the off the loop is in a sense that at a certain point, perhaps the technology will be advanced that, that the human will allow the system to run. That doesn't mean that there will never be a proverbial kill switch, but that the system, in a sense, has its own internal checks and balances. Perhaps it's generated through a layered system of artificial intelligence that it can adjust then to the environment and move on its own. The problem I see with a bit of that mental framework is we very rapidly, with almost any system, shifts from one of those mental buckets to another. We have, as we're working through this problem space, have to envision that the artificial intelligence system that we're talking about can be viewed from different standpoints. So one, it's a particular algorithm that's been trained on a particular set of data, right? And the computing power associated with that to perform a certain task, right? Very narrow version of narrow AI. Mm-hmm. But the reality is even when we're using our smartphones today, that there are a number of different systems that are operating in conjunction with each other, right? One may be paused, one may not, but in a sense, I think it's more fruitful to think of layered systems. Mm. And for the military, and even for cross industry, we for a time we'll have a lot of what we'll call legacy systems, right? In other words, we'll try to use artificial intelligence systems in a sense to improve the current systems and equipment that we already have, mm-hmm. as we're developing from the ground up fully artificial intelligence enabled systems as a whole. And I mentioned that it's related to a notion of lethal autonomy, because lethal autonomy tends to be the shiny object, right? There's a lot of concern. There's also a lot of hyperbole about it. But and part of that, I think, is unfortunate. That it's informed by all of us, myself included. I'm sure you too, Ira, right? Growing up with science fiction, yep. That sometimes isn't as helpful to really get to the grounding arguments that are both for and against, and our concerns about lethal mm-hmm. autonomy. And so, when people think of the Army or the Department of Defense developing AI, immediately the thought goes that we're going to use AI on the battlefield, and of course that's true. That is part of our mandate, right? Is to defend the Constitution of the nation, and if called upon to do that on the battlefield. But it's going to be much more ubiquitous, right? It's going to involve a lot of so-called back office applications. It's going to be used in areas such as predictive maintenance, such as talent management, the human resource side. It can be used, as I talked about with humanitarian interventions. There are projects in the Department of Defense looking at how we could leverage AI for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. For example, the fires in California, mm-hmm. right? Is there a way that we can better model them, sure. or other natural disasters? And the reason why that's important is when we focus on lethal autonomy, there's a tendency to think of the notion of killer robots, right? Sort of this independently, fully autonomous system with lethal capacity that's making individual decisions about whether to kill an individual or not. Mm. And we are far away from that, because sure. what everyone needs to understand on this call is that the Army is going to design, develop, deploy, and use AI, much like any other technology, in accordance with our nation's values and the rule of law. This is a very important concept, and it's informed by the international humanitarian law, the law of armed conflict, but it's also grounded in a philosophical theory, the just war tradition, mm-hmm. in the sense that certain conduct is morally permitted on the battlefield, but it's morally prohibited. Mm-hmm. And the two main focus areas are discrimination, the lawyers call it distinction, and proportionality. And so from the discrimination standpoint, you cannot intentionally target a non-combatant or civilian, right? And so, where artificial intelligence may actually assist in a positive way is enabling the commanders, the soldiers on that battlefield, to make those clear-cut decisions, right? In a sense, as Ron Arkin has said, is sort of remove some of the fog of war, right? These systems, in a sense, won't get tired, they won't get angry. But I would certainly appreciate, been involved in the numerous incidents where potentially, or in fact, there were civilians killed, right? That could help me parse that out to mm-hmm. avoid those sort of incidents. Yep. And then there's the issue of the proportionality as well. So coming back to this notion of total reconnaissance in a system of systems is, I think it's in a way, lethal autonomy is hard to define, and I can talk a bit about that more in a bit, but where we really want to think about how we might leverage AI on the battlefield is to look at our current systems now, right? So you have systems right now that consist of humans conducting reconnaissance, looking for the enemy, looking for the best routes for movements. You have intel analysts, again, humans that are sifting through that data, providing recommendations to the commander, right? Not just on where the enemy might be, what's the best path, what potentially are areas that cannot be struck, right? They're valuable, they're whether it's a hospital, right? I mean, they're prohibited targets. And then you have the whole logistics chain. You have to match, you know, the weapon system to best engage to create certain effects, again, that are lawful on the battlefield. And so what the Army is looking at through Project Convergence is how do we, one, decrease what we call the sensor to shooter time, right? But it's also the clearance of fires. Is there a way that we can leverage the technology so that we make less mistakes? And we do it in a much more timely fashion so that we can be more effective in doing our mission. And it's very important. I want everyone to understand that part of the consideration for leveraging technology to make better decisions on the battlefield, including those of discrimination, is, you know, concerned over the well-being of our own soldiers. So that not only in terms of that you know, she may be you know, concerned about her safety or you know, protecting her life in the fight against the enemy, but we also want to avoid moral injury, which is in a sense, you know, a mental and disconnect between expectations of fighting justly on the battlefield with some of the harsh realities of war. In other words, you know, whether we're talking about PTS or moral injury, you know, is there a way that we can be more accurate, more discriminating in terms of how we actually fight, right? So that when our soldiers return home, you know, they will bear less of a burden of some of those decisions or some of the things that they've witnessed. And that's certainly an area to further explore.
Really interesting. Along those lines, Dave, a couple of months ago, I did a show with Dr. Julie Marble over at Johns Hopkins, who, you know, specializes in sort of human factors in terms of trust and with some of these autonomous systems. And this is something else that I think you've written a little bit about in terms of sort of the soldier-centered designs of some of these new technologies. When it comes to sort of, you know, obviously the Army is huge and you have a million plus enlisted folks. This is really new stuff in terms of some of these tools. Talk a little bit about sort of the trust issues that you have to deal with when you're teaching some of these new technologies. Because obviously, you know, I'm sorry, sitting here and you know, with my movies and all, you know, there's always that scene in the movie nowadays where, hey, you know, the comms don't work. Okay, it's one thing, the comms are down because X, Y, and Z, but when it comes to trusting, you know, my autonomous partner here or whatever, talk a little bit about some of the thinking that goes on in your sort of area of technology and innovation when it comes to sort of the human autonomy pairing.
Yeah, so the human autonomy pairing, right? The human machine integration question is just becoming more and more relevant, right? So it doesn't change the fact that artificial intelligence enabled system is going to be a tool, but it's going to be much more closely integrated, right? In a sense where it's not potentially something I just pick up and use, like a rifle, like some other piece of equipment, but it's going to be more integrated in a way. It's, you know, further down the road, right, as the machines get more and more intelligent, we can see potentially as, you know, even forming partnerships in a way, right? And so the relevance of thinking about human-machine teaming needs to move beyond just thinking about the system itself. right? So traditionally, whether we're talking about testing evaluation, and the Army, like across the Department of Defense, has a long history of rigorous test and evaluation to ensure the safety of new equipment and tools, to ensure that it's reliable to be deployed. And we want to leverage that even as we move forward with this concept of human-machine teaming. But this notion of trust is really interesting, and I can't help, but as an analytic philosopher, to take a step back and unpack that a bit, right? Because how different people along the life cycle of an artificial intelligence system, right, from the design, development, deploy, and use phase, all think about the concept of trust from their own vantage point, right? So strictly from a testing evaluation, we might be talking about the reliability of that particular tool, right? But that seems necessary, but not sufficient when we think about the whole team, right? In other words, we can't just explore this from the tech side, right? Much like other uses of technology, even beyond human-machine teaming, these are really what some have called a social tech problem, right? That removing the human completely from that is misguided, right? And there is a lot of research from the human side, right? I mean, you have people in behavioral science and psychology that are looking at human interactions, but there's going to be something potentially unique as we begin to use artificial intelligence enabled systems more and more. So here's an example. Heard the deputy commander of Futures Command ask, how do we get the soldiers to trust this new technology? Right? And it seems a very simple question, but it belies something a bit more complex, right? Because there's a combination of a notion that we have to ensure that it's reliable, right? That in a sense, it's like a tool, right? Can you trust it? Does it perform as expected? This idea of justified confidence in its use. If it fails, it's going to fail in an expected way. These are the troubleshooting procedures that I know, in the sense of that kind of trust. But I think it also sort of includes the more a human side of trust, right? When we think of trust between humans, right, it implies a relationship. In a sense, there's a give and take. There may be an expectation of that the other individual is going to have some obligations, or perhaps I will, and that may inform some duties to one another. People can develop greater trust if someone keeps their promises. Perhaps they lose some trust in another individual because they've done things that perhaps have not kept their promises or done their duty. And that seems different from just ensuring that the system, that tool functions as needed. Now, and as intended. And so in a sense, it requires a combination, a more holistic look at the human-machine teaming, right? So you're getting both of those perspectives. But I do think even from the tech side, there is an important recognition to think about it from the human and the behavior side, as well as from the other side. So, for example, this notion of soldier-centered design, right? If you think about designing any new product, right, whether a company's doing that or whether the government's doing that for employment, you want to ensure that the user interface, the user design, UI UX, right, is part of that program. But in a way, I think now with developing AI systems, we're really borrowing a bit from software, where we think about how it's actually going to be employed. And you can't do that independently, no matter if you had, in a sense, subject matter experts, right, who might be able to talk academically about how it's going to be employed. It would be better to get actual users involved earlier in that life cycle, right, to be able to make those adjustments, in a sense, real time through the more agile design process that really everyone is adopting and thinking about artificial intelligence. So, for the Army, right, you involve soldiers early in it, and it's everything from the fit and wear to a cognitive load to how it might be employed in the situation, how fragile the system might be in terms of not just the brittleness of the AI, but in terms of how it's a part of the the mechanical widget that's in a sense attached or part of the soldier as she's accomplishing her mission. But then the other perspective is General Jim Rainey gave a talk on the AUSA, which is an annual conference that talks about the state of the Army, as well as technological trends and where we might see ourselves in the future. And he gave a lunchtime talk. And he said, when we think about, trusting in terms of individuals, in terms of other units, he has a simple formula. It's training plus testing equals trust. Mm. And I think it's a very useful analogy, even in thinking about this space, right? Because whether you're talking from the test side or even from just the human side, right? The Army's a large bureaucracy. And so by the time someone like me moves through the pipeline from basic training, right? The gaining unit, that commander, can expect that I have a certain set of skills, right? There's a sort of initial trust that I'm competent at a such and such level. That's not going to be sufficient, but at least there's that certain expectation. And then the unit then can train me in new skills, test me that ensure that I can complete those skills. And then, in a sense, the level of trust that they would have in me as a soldier, as a member of that team, will grow. And we do the same thing even in terms of units, right? So, when I've been deployed or even, at training, I will get cross-attached another unit. And they come, in a sense, at a certain level of trust because I, trust that they have met the certain training requirements. Mm-hmm. But do I really know them, right? And in a sense, hopefully I have an opportunity to train them myself and test them at home station before we're, say, deployed operationally. But even then, I might, restrict their employment in certain operations in areas that I'm confident that I know that they can accomplish that mission. And mm-hmm. based then on my evaluation of it, and since my own observation of how they're being tested operationally, then I can create the adjustments. And I think answering back to the ADC, the Deputy Commander of Futures Command's question, that actually informs part of this notion, right? So getting the soldiers and the users and commanders involved early in the design and development process, mm-hmm. getting their input through testing and evaluation of it, right? To ensure that it's not just safety, which is going to be, necessary, but it won't necessarily be sufficient for it to be responsible. And then, in a sense, putting it through its paces, right? Its training and testing before it's actually employed in the field is going to engender sort of this other aspect of trust, right? That they know that they can employ that and confidently. Because artificial intelligence is, very similar to other tech, but it is going to be unique, in particular with learning systems, right? By definition, sure. They're different the next day, right? Unless they're frozen upon deployment, right? And so, how we take a look at modifying our testing evaluation, right? How we look at the validation. Do we have a process of recurring validation if it is a continuing learning system, right? So, mm-hmm. It's getting new information, desires to be updated in situ, right? So, and thinking about the timing of it, thinking about how to do that in a responsible way, to ensure that we can, bottom line is deploy it responsibly.
Sure. What, when you haven't been thinking of all this and you're not teaching, you also had the opportunity to write a book. It's on the shelf there behind you, The Ethics of Military Privatization, the U.S. Armed Contractor Phenomena. It's interesting. I have somewhere around this house here, I have a book from about 20 years ago called Blood Song. And it's about sort of the story of one of the sort of the original modern private military companies' executive outcomes from South Africa. Maybe not a lot of people know that story. Many more are familiar, obviously, with Blackwater and in sort of recent decades. But now, I look at some of the firms that are out there that are sort of in the private military business, and these are giant Fortune 500 companies nowadays. talk a little bit, if you would, about why you wrote the book in the first place, sort of the genesis of all that. I mean, some of the things you discussed there. And then obviously linking to some of these themes we're talking about nowadays, when we get into private companies that can not just have military folks, contractors, but may have, private robots and private AI division. I mean, are there other concerns since you've written the book in 2016 that, wow, I didn't think about that then. Maybe I'll write a new issue about some of these emerging tools and concerns for privatization of them. Take that one, if you would.
Sure. Well first, that is a great idea. And so when I can carve out some time, I'll definitely an area that I want to continue to pursue. So really the genesis of that book, and I mean, much like, the thinking and the work that I'm doing here with Artificial Intelligence Task Force, it is based on personal experience. Mm-hmm. I have very good friends who are private contractors, and they ranged in all different aspects of, in particular in logistics, but also in other areas, in the mission command aspect of it. And I even worked closely with some of the security contractors who had, were protecting individuals, the Department of State individuals, work at the Justice Department overseas, et cetera. And I was really curious and again, part of it was being a bit naive, was I just assumed, at a young age that, everybody would be military, right? This was a military operation. And I really didn't appreciate how expansive both the government involvement would be, but also how the private sector really supports it. And the thing in doing the research, I realized a couple of things. One is the U.S. has a long history since our very foundings of relying upon private assistance in a variety of manners. And so in a way, it's not new. But then you had, relatively recently, like you mentioned, executive outcomes, you had companies that were hired to do offensive operations, right? They're hired to conduct, in a way, combat. Yeah. And so, for a long time, the global norm, in a sense, pushed that aside, right? So while you saw private service was the norm, throughout the Middle Ages and later into 17th and early 18th century, right? It was, really the shifting from the French Revolution on of developing a nation's army sort of, from its own population, right? So the Republican ideal, little r of providing service back to the community that which you live and thrive from. But there was much pushback against having mercenaries, both in the Middle Ages. Part of it because it became, decided this proverbial dirty word, right? That it was, they were running amok, that they have this bloodlust, that they need war in order to even, in a sense, as part of their business model. But when you do much more rigorous exploration, you realize that there are all kinds of aspects of what it takes to deploy an army overseas. Mm-hmm. And that you, in a sense, you don't have all of that expertise, nor do you have all that equipment, those resources resonant within the military itself. And so, at different times in our history, we've had to reach out to, private industry, whether it's for transportation, whether it's for expertise in our systems. And in a way, that's beginning to grow, right? As our technological systems are becoming more and more advanced, you don't have, in a sense, the resident expertise to do all maintenance and troubleshooting aspects of it, right? I liken it as an example of cars. My first car, I could mess with just about everything in it in order to keep it running much longer than it probably should have been running. But very rapidly, right, over the course of my adult life, they're becoming much more complex in a sense, controlled with computer systems, and in a way that I became less and less comfortable with my ability to do troubleshooting and maintenance on that vehicle. And so that's just one area where we've seen an increase in privatization. Part of the concern is how widespread privatization might affect the military when it considers itself as a profession, right? If we part of the notion and definition of a profession is we're responsible for, policing ourselves, but mostly responsible for this body of knowledge and expertise, right? And developing the in-house, the people to be able to work that. As we're potentially whole scaling, outsourcing different aspects of it, then eventually, right, we might lose some of that expertise in-house. The other dynamic that you see is that we're not the only country that has turned to privatization. So, we might use, what used to be KBR, DynCorp's done a number of times, right? Our log cap, logistic capacity, right? Logistical support contracting. And we certainly, it wasn't just the military, right? Department of Defense or state and others turned to private security, right, to tasks. Again, it wasn't to conduct these offensive operations, right? It wasn't, in a sense, like executive outcome. But we, in a sense, self-selected that, right? We chose to limit the tasks, the missions that we would allow a privatized element to be able to perform. And, quite frankly, whether it's other states or even non-state actors, right, even criminal organizations, they have no reason not to do that, right? So in other words, if there's a demand that's out there and someone's willing to offer those kind of services for a price, it's going to be very difficult to be able to control that. And nowadays, as you mentioned, with the new technology, right, it's, I mentioned earlier about the contractors that, they're coming to the FOB with the new equipment. We are going to continue to see that because it requires so much, specific expertise in maintaining a system. I can foresee that some of that will continue to be sourced by a private public partnership, so that we can, in a sense, have the soldier, she can be focused on actually employing that system to accomplish her mission, right? And so what dynamic does that might change further on? Well, I think one of the things with artificial intelligence is, very simply, it's the triad. It's algorithms, it's data, it's computing power that, it's going to be democratized, right, if you would. Some people might say there might be a proliferation, right? Even though we might, secure our algorithms and data, right, and our systems to be used in only certain circumstances, right, and again, in accordance with our values, you can see that that someone with more nefarious intentions might be able to, in a sense, repurpose it, right? I mean, or use a similar algorithm, right, to achieve different means, and that's troubling because, in a sense, this kind of technology, right, is much more difficult to have some sort of international control over the import and export of it, like you would, say, with more concrete components of a weapon system, like uranium. And so, it's not just that we might have near-peer adversaries that are going to employ AI systems on the battlefield, right? But you could have non-state actors also doing the same kind of thing, much like we saw in Syria and elsewhere, right? Taking an off-the-shelf quadcopter and putting a munition on it, and then flying that. So taking that technology has trickled down in the same way you could say some of this, and I think that raises another question about this concern and this desire to try to come to international consensus on whether we're banning or somehow controlling this broad concept of lethal autonomy, is really pinning down what exactly we mean by a lethal autonomous system. But then, how might we practically actually control that so that there would be, in a sense, no proliferation of the technology if we had deemed it as something that needed to be prohibited or banned, right? So, and I think that's where, that conversation, right, meaningful conversation between, the government, academia, and private sector is going to be absolutely essential moving forward, right? It just, that's not the only area, but it highlights this idea that, we want to ensure that the technology we're developing and the tools associated with that, and even the downstream spinoffs that come out of that, are going to be as a benefit to our, not just for national security, right, but for society as a whole.
Fascinating topics. I think you have another book there too, coming out of all this. Really, really interesting stuff, Dave. Talk a little bit, if you would, about some of your mentors, your influencers that have been along with you on this amazing journey that you had so far. Obviously, you met a lot of fascinating people in the service, in academia, in sort of the industry, collaborations that you've had. Obviously, there's probably a lot of them, but take some time, if you would, just to mention, shout out to some of the really important folks that have guided you on this path to date.
So, I'd mentioned earlier my grandfather, right? And again, it informed a lot of my thinking, not just about the need for service, but in a sense, how much you need to be responsible for your own learning and the pathway to how best to serve. Very fortunate to have a number of mentors in the department. Former department head, Brigadier General Tony Hartle, was not only instrumental in giving me the opportunity to come back to the department. Again, odd duck, aerospace engineer kind of guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Teaching philosophy. Is that even the right fit? He served not just in the department, but also on the shuttle commission. Right, so he demonstrated that you can take not just your experience in the military, but also your background in philosophy and ethics to be able to explore a technical problem. So when we had the failure, like the clump, right, like how best to identify what the causal chain was, but the proximate cause, and could you affect an organization even from someone externally? And I've had a number of opportunities to do that for the military in a couple of different dynamics. But he was also charged with creating a philosophy program here at West Point. After the cheating scandal in '76, the Borman Commission directed West Point to take a look at its honor code and develop a program of education that would help inform the students the ethical grounding of what an honor code might mean. Do not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. Those are it's in the sense part of the like a motto to follow this aspirational, but understanding that the philosophy behind that, and he was able to create a program where we would that every student here takes. That's a combination of critical reasoning and logic, normative ethical theories, right, to provide that grounding, and then a deep dive into just war theory. Right, so that our students would have a better understanding of not just what it meant to serve, their oath of office, but also when we talk about following the law of armed conflict, what that really meant and why that was grounded, and why the American public expected us to perform in that way. There have been a number of folks, including Alistair Norcross, Professor Norcross, at CU Boulder, who's a staunch utilitarian, but he really helped push me to think about my philosophical arguments and perspective and worldview in a more rigorous way, right? So by challenging some of my viewpoints, but then creating a space where I could also explore it, helped me refine not just my thinking about privatization, but also how I think about how to work in the emerging technology space. Another one, a great friend of mine is Dr. Heather Roth, who works at the Johns Hopkins APL, cool. Because she is so rigorous in terms of her approach that when I bounce ideas off her, I mean, she really helps me stay focused, and it was really a pleasure to work with her because she was the primary author for the DIB principles and really helped me explore that space And so I could better understand this notion of how we could have these aspirational principles, but yet then I could have a similar conversation, say with Army senior leadership, about what those principles actually mean in practice and how we might move forward. And there's of course many others, and too many to thank.
Sure.
But yeah, I've had a great ride. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's one of these with the number of roles that I've been able to do. You really begin to realize not just how important it is, but how much more work needs to be done.
Oh yeah.
Right. So opportunities like this to engage with the folks that we're speaking to today, the more conversations that we have, I think, can help people that represent these different stakeholders, right, especially in new technologies, at a minimum, have a better understanding of the different perspectives that we come from, right? Too often I find, folks in either academia, right, or in the private sector, don't realize that the Army follows the law of armed conflict, that they were informed by these ethical precepts. At the same time that, many of my military colleagues, don't understand some of the constraints that apply in the civilian world, that, as Neil deGrasse Tyson said, as one of the DIB board members in terms of AI, it's like a large portion of America has really great fears about the future of artificial intelligence. And some of those fears may be irrational, but we have to address them because, they're not just motivated by science fiction. They have real concerns about the future for themselves, for their families, for their communities. And it's incumbent on all of us, regardless of what camp that we come from, to not only address those, but then ensure that our work is going to be in line with that.
Outstanding. Outstanding. Dave, it's been an amazing story. I just have one other thing to ask you. Here's this is obviously the comical question of the show, but I want to do it anyway. Throughout your journey, have you, and especially with your scholarly understanding of just war and privatization and humanitarian issues and everything that goes along with sort of the philosophy in War and Peace, during your career, have you ever found yourself inside the Pentagon? I'm a child of the 1960s and a big fan of Peter Sellers. Have you ever said to anyone inside the Pentagon, "You can't fight in here. This is the Pentagon"?
That's right. Or come on, they're going to see the big board, right?
Exactly. You turn the big board. Okay. I just had to throw that one out there. But
well, it's funny you mention that. I'm actually one of those ones, fortunate or not, that never made it into the Pentagon since I was a child and went to visit my grandfather until very late in my career.
Okay.
And so it was always a place that, as a young officer, you said, kind of avoid that, right? No one wants to be close to the proverbial flagpole, right? There's way too many generals and seniors running around. But yeah, no, it's definitely an interesting place. So, but absolutely, no fighting there.
Okay.
For sure.
Oh, well, once again, David, it's been a really great time. I wish you the best with all of this. You have, as I said, a fascinating convergent set of responsibilities, and wishing you the best with all of it moving forward and what you're going to do, and obviously teaching the next generation. For everybody that's going to be listening to this show on the podcast or watching on the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Colonel Dr. David Barnes, Chief Artificial Intelligence Ethics Officer at the United States Army Artificial Intelligence Task Force, professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point, where he's the deputy head of the Department of English and Philosophy, and a research associate for their Center of Innovation and Engineering, senior AI ethics advisor for DARPA, still 30-year career officer in the United States Army. Check out his book, The Ethics of Military Privatization and the U.S. Armed Contractor Phenomena. Dave, I want to just once again thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us. Thank you for everything you're doing. And as we say on the show, thank you through your initiatives for helping to create a safer and better tomorrow for all of us. It's been really a fascinating time listening to your story.
Thank you so much. indeed been an honor and an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you today. So I look forward to further conversations and continued collaboration and work in this important space. So thank you again.
And once again, I was remiss. Thank you again for your long service to the country. It's an honor talking to you.